Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the ECA monthly national call. We're excited tonight about this call, Mobilizing Voters with Nathaniel Sinnett from the Environmental Voter Project. ECA and EVP have been longtime partners on the Elders Promote the Vote Project, phone banking, postcarding, and canvassing voters. For those of you who are new to Elders Climate Action, we are grandparents, great uncles, and great aunts, and everyday folks. We're determined to do all we can to leave a livable planet for future generations and for all life. Our programs, communications, and chapters are focused on engaging elders in building the political will needed to solve the climate crisis. At ECA, we are elder-centered and volunteer-driven, seeking to inform, inspire, and engage older generations to take action on the climate crisis at the local, state, and federal levels. We are always looking for volunteers to join our national leadership committees. Reach out if you'd like to learn more. We'll drop links in the chat. Tonight, we're going to hear from Nathaniel Sinnett about EVP's efforts. You'll hear from a few ECA members about what it's like to be part of Elders Promote the Vote, and we'll tell you how you can get more involved. Now, about this call, it's going to be an hour and 15-minute session. Nathaniel will present, followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to add questions for Nathaniel in the Q&A box. We will follow the national call with a short action party, about 15 minutes, starting at 8 p.m. with our partners at Climate Action Now using their app. We hope you'll stay on for the action party and help us reach our goal of 2,500 actions in 2024. Our speaker tonight, Nathaniel Sinnett, founded the Environmental Voter Project in 2015 after over a decade of experience as a senior advisor, consultant, and trainer for local campaigns and issue advocacy nonprofits. Hailed as a visionary by the New York Times and dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine, Sinnett is a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques and the behavioral science behind getting people to vote. He's held a variety of senior leadership and campaign management positions on U.S. Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and he sits on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. Formerly an attorney at the international law firm DLA Piper LLP, Sinnett holds a BA from Yale University and a JD from Boston College Law School. He lives in Boston, Massachusetts with his wife and 2 children. So Nathaniel, please take it away.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you so, so much. Oh my gosh, is it an honor to be doing this work with amazing activists and volunteers and organizers like Francis and Leslie and Pam and Ariana, and amazing volunteers like Wanda and Deb, and amazing founders like Brett, and all of you who are taking time tonight to learn how you can get more involved and make more of a difference. I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. Yes, I did say that. We're going to have fun on Zoom, believe it or not. But I did just want to start by saying how incredibly fortunate I feel to be doing this work with you. All right. I'm going to share my screen. And if you're anything like me, what you really want at the beginning of a Zoom call is to kind of know what's coming. And so I always like to start my presentations with a slide that tells you what's coming. So as Francis said, after I present, there will be a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please put them in that little Q&A folder. For most of you, it's going to be at the bottom of your screen. Also, after I present, you're going to hear from some great Elders Climate Action volunteers who have been calling these voters that I'm going to talk about. But before we get there, I'm going to start by giving a very brief introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. Please forgive how brief this is going to be. We are working under the assumption that most of you know either a little bit or a lot about the Environmental Voter Project already. So rather than spend this entire presentation going over the Environmental Voter Project, it's just going to be a really, really quick primer for those of you who are new and refresher for those of you who are old. We're then going to get into some of our recent research on older climate voters, people who care deeply about climate and are 65 years and older. We're then going to discuss what our targets look like, our voter targets look like over the next 3.5 months, and then your opportunities to have an impact. So let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just two things, and that's finding environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find environmentalists who don't vote and then turn them into better voters. And what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that many other environmental nonprofits do. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. In fact, a good way to think about us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. We want to find people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They care so much about climate and the environment that it's already their number one priority, but they're not voting. And so that means even though they don't need their mind changed, they do need their behavior changed. And that frees us up to make this purely behavioral intervention with messaging that isn't focused on trying to convince them to care more about climate. It's just focused on trying to get them to vote. Now, the reason we take this very specific approach is because it turns out that there are huge numbers of environmentalists who don't vote. If we go back to the last presidential election in 2020, we estimate that 8 million already registered voters, they're already registered, they're past that hurdle. 8 million already registered voters who are likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority just stayed home and didn't vote. They didn't vote. In a presidential election that was decided by 44,000 votes across 3 states, 8 million already registered super environmentalists didn't vote. Now, obviously, even more people don't vote for midterms, right? And so you'll see 13 million sat out the midterms. And I get it. It is frustrating to see numbers like this. But I also think it's important to see the other side of this coin and to realize that this also presents a tremendous opportunity, because it's become increasingly hard to change people's opinions about anything these days, but especially climate change. Yet these millions of non-voting environmentalists, they represent an enormous population of people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They are already with us. They care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority. They're just not voting. They need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course, it's not easy, but it is easier. And it is also testable. Because as many of you might know, who you vote for is secret in the United States. But whether you vote or not, that's public record. And so what we can do is we can run messaging experiments with these non-voting environmentalists. And then after the election, when public voter files are updated, we can actually see which messages work and get non-voting environmentalists to become new voters and eventually consistent voters. So that's what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. It's a 4-step process. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail on all 4 steps because we have limited time this evening, but very briefly, this is how the process works. First, we need to find these non-voting environmentalists, right? Now, we obviously can't interview every single American to figure out which of them list climate as their top priority. But we can poll huge numbers of them, isolate the ones who say that climate's their number one priority, and then build highly accurate models to try to find other people like them. And it's a long iterative process where we access lots of public data and we refine these models and get them more and more and more precise. But at the end of this long process, what we are able to do is assign a score to every single registered voter in each state where we work, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority over all other issues. And obviously, if you have a low score, if you're really unlikely to list climate as your top priority, well, we're not going to talk to you. We don't care about whether you vote or not. We want to focus on the people who have a really, really high likelihood. Usually we target people who have at least an 85% likelihood of literally listing climate as their number one priority. And then we look at public voter files to see whether they have a history of voting or not. And if they don't, then those are our targets. This is how we identify these non-voting environmentalists. That gets us to step 2, mobilization. Now, remember, we have a population of people who don't need to be convinced to care more about climate change. They don't need to be educated on these issues. They just need to change their voting behavior. And so that allows us to be completely agnostic with our messaging. We can now run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, these kind of gold standard experiments in social science, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to do just one thing and one thing only, and that is to start voting. And we don't honestly need to even talk about climate change in this messaging, because these people already care about that. We just need to figure out how to get these people to vote. And we've got hundreds of these experiments that have helped us optimize this messaging. And then we arm our volunteers with it. So when they're writing postcards and making phone calls and knocking on doors, they aren't using scripts that really creative, smart people came up with. No, they are using proven scripts, which in randomized control trials have proven to increase turnout of these non-voting environmentalists. And we now work with over 7,000 volunteers to run these mobilization campaigns. And in addition to the postcards and door knocking and phone calls that volunteers do, we as a staff also run direct mail and digital ad campaigns with these messages. Step 3, habit reinforcement. We live behavioral science every day. You don't need to in order to intuitively understand that you can't change someone's behavior if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. That's not how you create habitual voters. I'm sure that doesn't surprise any of you. No, you need to talk to these non-voters as often as possible. And so what that means is that at the Environmental Voter Project, we view every election as a precious opportunity to change people's voting behavior. So many of you who already volunteer with Elders Climate Action and work with the Environmental Voter Project, maybe last week you were calling low propensity environmental voters in Arizona for their upcoming July 30th primary. Or maybe you were calling voters in Kansas for their primary that's a week later. And the reason you're doing that is not just because those elections are important in and of themselves, but also because the best way to make a brand new climate voter on November 5th is to see if you can get them to vote this summer in their low propensity primaries. If you do that, I guarantee they'll show up again in November. And that brings us to step 4, changing the electorate. Ultimately, what our goal is to so dramatically increase the number of consistent climate voters, not non-voters. Politicians don't care about the non-voters, but consistent climate voters, that politicians find it harder and harder and harder to not lead on climate. Because at the Environmental Voter Project, our theory of change is based on something very simple. And that is that nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Politicians want to win elections. And the way you win an election is by getting the most votes. So politicians always end up having to go where the votes are. It's just the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. So what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we are laser focused on trying to dramatically increase the number of climate voters. Because if we can do that, politicians have to start leading on climate or they ain't going to be politicians for much longer. If you want to learn more about our work, you can go to environmentalvoter.org. Very briefly, I'm just going to go over some of our results and then get into the older climate voter research that I mentioned. We measure our impact in two ways. The first is through what's called randomized control trials. These isolate what our impact is in particular elections while controlling for all other variables. So what we do is we set aside a control group of non-voting environmentalists and don't talk to them. And then after the election, we compare turnout among the people we targeted to the people in that control group. And that allows us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for what all other groups and campaigns are doing. And just in the last 4 years, in 2020, in 21, in 22, and 23, you can see that we have been able to prove with what's called statistical significance, which means it wasn't due to random occurrence, that these campaigns we run were solely responsible for increasing turnout among our targets by as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. If those don't seem like big numbers to you, ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8% is in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you. These are big, big numbers in politics. The second way that we measure our impact is over the long term. Every time we communicate with one of these low propensity climate voters, we tag them in our voter file so we can track them and see how their voting behavior changes. And since we launched our little one city proof of concept back in 2015 and 2016, we have now communicated with over 10.5 million unique individual voters, all of whom, by definition, care deeply about climate and the environment, but were pretty awful voters or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of about 2.5 months ago, 2.5, we looked on voter files and we saw that over 1.8 million of them are now such consistent voters that they have voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They have become super voters. They have become such consistent voters that if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and you'd say, yep, that person's going to show up. Got to go knock on their door. Should probably also poll them to figure out what issues they care about. Ultimately, this is how we build this unstoppable block of climate voters that politicians won't be able to ignore. This is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I want to be clear, this is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible because I can tell you no one else is talking to these really awful voters. We're the only group who talks to them in big elections and certainly in small elections. And it's something that all of you should be extraordinarily proud of. All right, I told you it would be a very brief overview of what EVP does. If you want more information, you can find out at environmentalvoter.org/about. All right, I mentioned to you that recently we did some research on older climate voters in particular. Some of you might have been aware that about 5 or 6 months ago, we came out with a report called Gray is the New Green. And a lot of folks organizing this call thought it would be interesting if I went over some of that data, because I think a lot of people assume that the climate movement and the environmental movement is just all young people. And I'm not sure that ever was the case, but it certainly isn't the case now. And so I thought it would be really important to share some of this data with you. We looked in all of the states where we work at these people who are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority. And here's what we found. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, almost 30% of them fit that criteria. So almost 30% of 18 to 34-year-olds in our 19 states were likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority. Then you'll see it goes way, way down. 35 to 49 is less than 10%. 50 to 64, woo, much, much lower. But then look at people age 65 and older. Was the second largest group, second largest age group that had these climate first voters in it. More than 1 out of 6 65 and older registered voters are likely to list climate and the environment, not just as important, but as their number one issue. And look at this. It is remarkably consistent from state to state. Just looking at 4 really important battleground states this fall, look, you can see the same curve. It's almost like a Nike swoosh, right? Like it starts really high and it goes down and then comes up in every single state. And look at this. This really shows how consistent it is. So this is all of the states that we studied. And you see, in some states, there are many, many more climate first voters. In other states, there are far fewer. But in every single one of the states, the age group that has the most climate first voters is 18 to 34-year-olds. And the age group that has the second most is 65 and up. This is absurdly consistent. Absurdly consistent. Now, what do we know about, in particular, these voters age 65 and older who are likely to list climate as their number one priority? Well, the first is there is a significant gender gap. So the way to read this chart is first look at these yellow bars. What those yellow bars are is the sex breakdown among all registered voters in the states that we studied. And you can see 55% of registered voters age 65 and older are women, and 45% are men. Now, if you looked at all registered voters, there would still be about a 5% sex gap or gender gap. It's broader, it's bigger among older people, mostly because women live longer than men. So just men die a little bit sooner. And so the gender gap is even bigger when you look at people 65 and older. But then look at the people who are 65 and older who are likely to list climate as their top priority. That gender gap almost doubles. It almost doubles. So what this means is if you look at all of these climate first voters who are 65 and older, 59% of them are women, 40% are men. A big, big gender gap. So the first thing you can take away here is when you're looking at these older climate voters, they are disproportionately women by a pretty significant margin, twice as large as the underlying gender gap that exists among older registered voters. You can also see that these are the 18 states that we studied, that in some states, these older climate voters make up an enormous percentage of the electorate. So the way to think about this chart, the way to read this chart is 10.2% in New Mexico. What that means is people who are 65 and older who are likely to list climate as their top priority are such a large group in New Mexico that they make up 10.2% of all registered voters. That's huge. That is huge. And you can see it's also a really, really big number in Maine and New Hampshire. These are not unimportant states. I mean, if they were unimportant states, we wouldn't be working in them. But even in federal elections, these are not unimportant states. But now look at some of the real sort of traditional battlegrounds. Arizona, older climate voters make up 4.8% of all registered voters in Arizona, 4.7% in Pennsylvania. This is a bigger issue in the climate movement. This concept of pluralistic ignorance. I'm not sure if any of you are aware of this, but it's this concept where most people underestimate how many others there are who are like them. So in the climate movement, one of the biggest problems we have is that we underestimate how many other Americans care deeply about climate change. I also think this probably is taking place among older climate activists. My guess is that although many of you are extraordinarily proud of your work, you might not realize how many other older people care just as much about climate as you do. And it's so important to internalize this data and realize you are not alone. You are not alone in this fight. There are huge, huge numbers of older climate voters out there. And you can see in some states, they are difference makers. They are absolutely difference makers. All right. As we look ahead to the next 3.5 months, where again, we are targeting low propensity climate voters, this is what we are seeing. First, these are the 19 states that we are active in. I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A if you're curious why these states and not other states. But very, very briefly, we work in states where there are lots of non-voting environmentalists. You'll see that most of the big battleground states are included in that, but Michigan and Wisconsin aren't. And that's not because Michigan and Wisconsin are unimportant. Dear God, are they important? But there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. But in swing states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, holy moly, are there a lot of these non-voting environmentalists. In fact, we've identified 4.8 million, and this is who we are targeting. These are 4.8 million voters who are already registered to vote. So they've passed that hurdle. They are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their #1 priority. Yet, we think they are unlikely to vote on November 5th without a sophisticated mobilization campaign pushing them to do so. Why do we think they're unlikely to vote? Because after we identified all these people, we looked at their public voting histories, and we saw that they had not voted in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. So that's who we are targeting. 4.8 million registered voters in these 19 states who are likely to list climate as their top priority, but they didn't vote in 2020 or any election since then. And I'm not going to go through all 19 states, but just to give you a sense of what the numbers look like in some states that are probably on the top of your mind, we've identified 230,000 into Arizona. What does a number like that mean in Arizona? Well, remember, back in 2020, Arizona was only decided by 10,400 votes. And we're targeting 230,000 low propensity environmental voters. Pennsylvania, we've identified almost 250,000. Georgia, 490,000. These low propensity environmental voters are an enormous opportunity, not just because there are so many of them, but because, again, they are people who don't need to be convinced to start caring about something that they don't already care about. They just need to be given this voter turnout messaging. And you're going to hear from Wanda and Deb in a little bit about what it's like to speak to these voters. But the messaging that works best is so much easier to deliver than if you are volunteering for a campaign or you're trying to convince people, oh, well, you might not support this candidate yet, but let me tell you why you need to support them. That's hard. This is much easier, and we know that it works. And so you have an enormous opportunity through Elders Climate Action over the next 3.5 months to have a big, big impact mobilizing these low propensity environmental voters. And in particular, there are 3 things. Every single Friday, every single one, There is an 11 a.m. Eastern phone bank. You log on. If you've never done it before, you will be trained. If it takes you 10 minutes to do the training, great. If it takes you an hour, that's totally fine. We will hold your hand. We will make sure that you feel comfortable. And what's more, I can promise you, because I know what the script says, that what you're being asked to say to voters has been proven in multiple experiments to increase turnout of these low propensity environmental voters. We know how much your time is worth, and we would never ask you to do something unless we had hard evidence that it actually works and makes a difference. You can use this QR code. For those of you who know how to use a QR code, or for those of you who don't, you open up the camera on your phone and you focus on this thing, and then the website will pop up. But I also imagine that in the chat, you will be given links that help you sign up for these phone banks. The second thing is, I know that Pam is working what seems like around the clock running these postcarding campaigns. Many of you just participated in writing postcards to folks in Arizona. The next postcarding campaign that the Environmental Voter Project is going to be doing with Elders Climate Action is to low propensity environmental voters in Texas. Again, we take a pretty unique approach to postcards. We don't let you pick the design. We don't let you pick what to say. We're a little nitpicky. We're a little precise about this. But the reason we do it is, again, because we value your time. You don't want to do something that doesn't work. You want to do something that has been proven to work. So when we ask you to write postcards to voters, we are giving you a proven design and a proven script that, again, in a randomized control trial has been proven to increase turnout of these non-voting environmentalists. And then finally, door-to-door canvassing. If you happen to live in or near Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Tucson, or Austin, we are doing door-to-door canvassing in those 4 cities because in those areas, the number of non-voting environmentalists we've identified is so large and they are so densely packed together that it takes you no time at all to go from door to door to door and mobilize them to vote. And again, you can find information on how to sign up for door-to-door canvassing by going to the URL that pops up with this QR code. It's also environmentalvoter.org. I also know that anybody at EVP or anybody at ECA or PAM could help you with this. Thank you. It is an enormous honor and an enormous pleasure to be doing this work with all of you. I believe we're now going to hear, before the Q&A starts, I believe we're going to hear from Deb and Wanda, who have been doing a lot of work with Elders Climate Action, calling these voters. But I'm not the master of ceremonies here, so I'll let Pam or Francis tell you what's coming up next. But thank you all.
I can jump right in, Francis, if you like. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Nathaniel. And Pam, let's pivot to you and to our volunteers.
You got it. So for those of you who don't already know me, I'm the project manager for ECA's Elders Promote the Vote. And honestly, I thought I knew a lot about environmental organizations, having been interested in them since, I don't know, maybe I wasn't even a preteen. Then I took a better look at Environmental Voter Project and Elders Climate Action, and I found the organization that my training in sociology and social psychology and public policy tells me can have the biggest impact possible with our time and our money. So I'm going to ask everyone on this call. This is like where you say, hey, someone should call 911. No, call 911. If you're on this call, I need you to come and join us this Friday at 11 a.m., 8 a.m. Eastern. Try that once more. 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific for 75 minutes of phone banking preceded by a very special VIP speaker and the training that Nathaniel mentioned for those who need it. There's some information in the chat about this. So now I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing 2 of our volunteers so they can tell you what it's actually like to phone bank with ECA. part of why I'm stumbling over my words, because I want to make sure that they get all the time they need to speak. I'm going to introduce Wanda first. Wanda Bennett is concerned about the environment and the effects of climate change. She is a native of Miami, Florida, and a high school graduate, and an amazing phone bank volunteer. She moved to Valdosta, I probably said that wrong, Valdosta, Georgia in late 2020. She has been a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, as well as with EVP and Elders Climate Action, and has started phone banking 3 months ago. Hope I have that right. I thought you've been doing it much longer. She enjoys phone banking with Elders Climate Action and EVP to encourage environmental voters to get out and vote. Take it away, Wanda.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm, of course, hi, Pam, how are you? And I am, of course, a ECA phone banker, and I have also, as she said, been phone banking with other climate groups. Environment is so dear to me, but what is really dear to me and what's most concerning to me is our democracy. We have such an opportunity to get out and vote. And just as Nathaniel had said, that there are a lot of environmentalists who already care about voting, but the environment, but they don't need to be, pushed or their hand held who to vote for, just mobilizing and getting out and vote. What I do, and I love to do, is to call on the phone bank and reach out to persons through the ECA phone bank every Friday and let them know that there are ways that they can actually vote. Some people face barriers and don't know what barriers, what's out there for them. Some persons don't know that they can mail a vote. I face many barriers. I don't have transportation, but then I do know from contacting county elections office that there are groups that are willing to get me out to the polls to vote. As he said, the battleground state in Georgia, it is truly a battleground state. And there are many people that are my age in the elders community who are concerned about the environment and they are not getting out and voting. Phone banking with ECA is one of the great opportunities to reach out to people and let them know that it's people like you and me who care about voting and the environment. I enjoy every Friday when Pam has guest speakers come on. There's a young lady by the name of Layla. She came out of the state of Virginia, and she has helped with a climate policy there. She was so inspirational in letting me know that even though conversations that I'm not reaching out with people sometimes, that it's still inspiring to call people. Sometimes it gets a little aggravating where I don't reach a person. I may call and then there's a hang up, or there's just someone is not answering. But then that one person who I get contact with really gives me the inspiration to keep moving and going. It's so important. I wish some of you all would join me at ECA. It's such a privilege and an opportunity. And also, it's our democracy to get out and get these people to vote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wanda. And I just put a little bit more about Layla, the young woman she mentioned, into the chat for folks. I'll share some other links later. So now we're going to hear from Deb. Deb Nam Crane is an indie novelist, organizer, master urban gardener, mother, home banker, wife, and sister in Boston proper. Her proudest achievement is raising 4 politically engaged, all-around fantastic human beings. And both these women are the kind of folks who I realized, not knowing until I talked to them more, that's how much we both have in common. Please take it away, Deb.
Thank you. I'm going to be reading from prepared statements in the interest of time, so I apologize if I sound stilted. I think I could also say what Wanda said, and that would get it across. But here I go. I have a lot going on, but I'm coming regularly to the ECA Friday phone banks because these calls are to save our democracy, and this is not an exaggeration. At the same time, doing this is among the most low-pressure ways to advocate that are available for concerned citizens like me. Similarly, what we're asking of voters is also as low pressure, I think, as we can get. We're basically saying, here's some voting information. And then, by the way, do you want to tell us when you're voting? I'm like a sensitive person, a very, very sensitive person, but I don't take it personally when I make these calls and maybe get hangups or someone even cusses me out, because I know how badly we need to make these calls and get people to vote. I'm a mother of 4, and my oldest, who's now 30, broke my heart several years ago when she told me that she worried that she didn't have a future. Climate wasn't the only issue, but it was definitely one of them. All of my children have been affected physically and psychologically by climate change, and the idea that I would ask them to do my job by saving the planet, just I don't have words. Our children are suffering in unimaginable ways, mentally and emotionally, and it's just not fair to ask them to basically clean up our messes and our parents' messes. So making phone calls like this is it's a drop in the bucket. It's the least I can do. Lastly, the guest speakers that Pam is having speak briefly before we start calling have been another good reminder to all of us, myself included, and another reason that I hope people join us. One of them, Sri, is a youth climate leader with Pam's nonprofit, Climate Change Recovery, and he mentioned that by doing her program, Youth and Adults Acting for Our Earth, or YAY, he is able to make an impact on the climate crisis, even though he can't vote. He started at a younger age and is now 18, but he was born in another country, India, and is not an American citizen. I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and most of my great-grandparents or their parents were also immigrants, but this young man reminded me of how important it is that we do this work for all of those who aren't allowed to vote here. America matters, for better or worse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have a quick last plug for Friday's Phone Bank. We just lined up a very special person who's going to make calls and speak to us. And no, I'm not biased, even though I'm her mom. She is a federal youth climate plaintiff, Miko Vergun, who is part of the reason I'm here, because she spoke before ECA back in 2017 and came back awed by these adults who understood, instead of saying things like, hey, it's so awesome, we really appreciate your generation coming along to save us. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Frances.
Thanks so much, Pam and Deb and Wanda. And thank you, Nathaniel. But we're still on the hot seat for a little while for questions. So get started with the Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A box. First question is, why do postcards have to be sent on a fixed day before an election? That many people ask why they have to do it on that day.
Great question. So there are a few reasons. First off, there are certain states that have very limited early voting windows. We want postcards to land in voters' mailboxes at a moment in time where they can actually look at it and act and vote. So we want to time you dropping your postcards in the mailbox so that they will then arrive with voters in that magic window where they can actually vote. Second reason, we don't want them to arrive after Election Day has already happened. And you might think you know the post office pretty well, but we know it even better because we spend a lot of time working with the post office and figuring out how long it's going to take for this stuff to be delivered. The third and final reason, I know this doesn't apply to anybody on the call here, but every now and then, people don't follow instructions and let us know that they've actually mailed the postcards. And so we need to do a lot of follow-up with hundreds of different volunteers to make sure that they've actually done it. And if the moment you're supposed to drop your postcards in the mailbox is so close to Election Day that we're doing that follow-up 3-4 days before Election Day, you know what happens? We're not able to do all the other things we ought to be doing to make sure that environmentalists vote. And so that's why we try to pick one day so that we know and that you know that these postcards are landing with voters at the right time to do what all of us want, and that is get them to vote.
Right. So another question is, how many of our non-voting environmentalists we're trying to reach are in swing states?
Great question. So first off, let me just say there are a lot of different ways to think of swing states, right? Most people wouldn't consider, say, New York as a swing state. But I think by any objective measure, New York will decide which party controls the House of Representatives next year. They have 8, that's right, 8 competitive congressional districts. Moreover, my guess is a lot of you last week were looking at the news and thinking, what? Virginia's a swing state? New Hampshire, New Mexico is a swing state? No, I don't know if that's going to remain true. But sometimes places that aren't swing states have a way of becoming swing states. We work in the states where we work because we are convinced that we can have an enormous impact, not just on the federal level, but the state and local level. But if we ignore the US House, if we ignore really important gubernatorial elections that are happening, if we ignore important state legislative races. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should ignore all of these things, but let's say we did. Let's say all we cared about is the presidential election. I would suggest to you you should care about more than just that, but let's just say that's all that we cared about. Just those presidential battlegrounds, the Environmental Voter Project is targeting, let's take Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, and Georgia. Just in those 5 states, so 5 of the 7 really big battleground states, I believe that we are targeting over 1.4 million unique individuals. So a lot of people, a lot of people.
Well, the next set of postcards that Elders Promote the Vote is going to be doing will be going into Texas. So could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in Texas?
Absolutely. So Texas has, I wouldn't put it as sort of a top tier competitive US Senate race, but it's still pretty competitive. Most people don't think it's a toss up, but they think it's leaning Republican. So it has an important US Senate race. It has a lot of important state House and state Senate races. And there are 3 very competitive US House district races there. Moreover, there is no state that is as rapidly urbanizing as Texas is. Texas is becoming more and more like, say, Georgia and Virginia each year. It also is a very important state because whereas you used to be able to say that Louisiana was pretty much the capital of toxic air and toxic water, Texas has given it a run for its money these days. And so there are a whole bunch of environment first voters who need our help there because every day new petrochemical plants are being put in. Every day people are suffering because they don't have the political power to get local elected officials to zone a petrochemical plant out of existence or things like that. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why we're paying attention to Texas. But even if you just are laser focused on the next 3.5 months, if you're laser focused on November 5th, there are 3 really, really tight congressional races in Texas, a pretty important US Senate race.
Great. So we'll definitely can have an impact there. Question about phone banking. And when someone's phone banking, is it their phone number that shows up, or is it going to be some ECA or EVP phone number?
It's an EVP phone number. No one will ever be able to call you back. It's an EVP phone number.
And just to add a wee bit, you'll share your first name and that you're a volunteer with Environmental Voter Project. That's their tip off that you care about the environment too, but you won't share your last name.
Great. So if people have more questions, please put them in the Q&A. We also have a question for Wanda and Deb. If you could tell us some stories about one or more calls you made that really seemed to have an impact?
I'm happy to go first. So I have, and Nathaniel, I hope you don't get upset about this, but I have changed the order of the script just a little bit, where after I tell them that they have a primary, early voting is happening now, instead of asking them, and how are you going to vote, I then ask, do you need any information about the logistics around voting? And I'm doing that because I want to emphasize that we're here to help. And then I follow up with, and how are you going to be voting? But it is very gratifying. First of all, I'm not getting hung up on as much. But second of all, it's very gratifying to me when I'm just giving people websites or even giving people phone numbers. That just like that feeling like, oh, okay, here's somebody who does want to vote and didn't have the information, and I am providing them with what they need in order to make that happen. It's simple, but to me, that means a lot.
Right.
Yeah. I had a call where I had a young lady who had served some time in jail, and so she had been a felon, or had a criminal background or something, but she didn't know that her rights were restored. So I gave her a number on where to call at, 1-866 vote. It's somewhere there in our talking thesis when we're talking to one. And she called to verify. I gave her that information. She didn't know, she had not voted for many, many years. And so she wasn't aware that she could call and find out if she would be able to get out and vote after something that happened with her like maybe a couple of decades ago. And she didn't realize, that maybe her rights would be restored to vote. So that was very impactful to me, that I was able to give her that information. She just didn't know. There are persons that want a second chance. They may have not did nothing so bad, but something that was just probably bad enough to not be able to vote. And so like I said, this is something that happened to her a couple of decades ago, about 20 years ago. And so I was able to give her a number. And so that's one person that really resonated with me.
Right. That's, really made a significant difference for that person. That's a wonderful thing.
Francis, can I add something really quickly? One of the things that's amazing about the script from Environmental Voter Project is it really does cover every pretty much conceivable thing that might happen. And so people often worry about, oh, should I read it all? Do I have to memorize it? None of that. You just come. If you get someone who says something like that, you can easily search and find the word felon, and then you know what to say to that person. So it's all laid out there before you, anything that could come up. So it's a lot easier than I think people expect. Thank you.
One question I think probably goes best to Pam is if someone's taken the training for text this text bank, but I think I might mean phone banking and sending postcards, but wasn't sure where to be able to get set up for that. How do they do that?
So for the training for postcards, I put my email in the chat. I'll put it in again in a minute. I would say either way, you can just email me. For the training for postcarding, we only have a few spots left in Texas. There's 2 videos that you can watch, and that will go out to you when you ask me for more information about it. It probably is also in your email if you're part of Elders Climate Action. With phone banking, you just show up. 8 o'clock, I do a real quick intro. In a couple minutes, you'll hear from our guest speaker. They'll speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'll do the training. So it's offered every Friday on the clock at around 8:15. You join at 8. And by, say, the 8:30, 8:45, at the outside, you'll be ready to make calls. Usually we're done by about 8:30 unless people have a lot of questions. And I have done some specialized trainings also for folks who felt like they needed some extra help. So that's available as well.
Nathaniel, we have a question about texting.
Yes. So some of you might remember that the Environmental Voter Project used to text voters. we stopped about 2.5 years ago, and we stopped for the following reasons. All of the mobile phone carriers got together and they said, you are not allowed, you being everybody, are not allowed to text people who haven't previously opted in to receiving your texts. Now, obviously, if you're texting voters, they have not previously opted into receiving your texts. Now, to be clear, this is not a law. It is what all of the mobile phone carriers got together and decided that they would do. It would be sort of rules in the industry. When this happened, a lot of organizations, ourselves included, stopped texting voters. Some did not. I'm sure you don't need me to remind you of that. You're probably still getting some texts. I don't have anything bad to say about those organizations that are continuing to text voters, but let me tell you why we haven't started doing it again. One, all of the mobile phone carriers keep telling us that they are going to fine people, fine organizations for texting folks who haven't opted in. Now, these fines haven't come down yet. They've been saying this now for 1.5 years and it hasn't happened. But I don't think that donors to the Environmental Voter Project want their money to go towards paying off fines after we've been told that they were going to happen. But two, the second reason, which is even more important than that one, what we do know is already happening is that anywhere from 50 to 70% of the texts that volunteers send are being blocked and not delivered to those voters. One of the most important things we can say at the Environmental Voter Project is that whenever we ask a volunteer to do something, we know with proven evidence from previous experiments that their time is well spent and they are turning non-voters into new voters. But if we ask you to text and we know ahead of time that as many as 70% of the texts you send never reach those voters, it feels very dishonest to me. And boy, can we use your time better than that. So that's why we aren't doing it. If I were running a presidential campaign and there were 3.5 months until the end of everything, would I ask people to text? Yeah, maybe I would. Maybe I would. So I don't begrudge other groups that do that. But I think we have a very good reason for not doing it, which is we might get fined enormous amounts of money, and most of the volunteer texts are never actually getting delivered. So that's why we don't text. And as a reminder, we know that the postcards work. We know that the phone calls work. We know that the door-to-door canvassing works. If we've got 3 things that we know work, why ask volunteers to do a 4th thing that we don't know works?
Thank you. I miss texting, but that's a really good reason for us not to be doing it now. People have been asking about this recording. We will be sending everyone who registered a link to the recording, and it's going to go up on our YouTube channel. Some people have been asking about the chat. If you go to the chat window and down at the bottom on the right-hand side, you'll see 3 little dots. If you hit those 3 little dots, a little thing will drop down that says Save Chat. Choose Save Chat, and it will save the chat to your computer. So that's an easy way to keep track of those links. But if for some reason that doesn't work and there's something you really need to know, please send us an email and we will figure it out for you. Pam, there was a question about postcards and do you mail the card? Will you be mailing the cards to us? And are the cards pre-addressed? Who buys the postage? How much does it cost per card? Those sorts of logistical things.
Yeah, you bet. So there are costs to all these. We'd love for people to donate toward Elders Climate Action to be able to help support that Environmental Voter Project as well. What you do is if you register and you get one of those spots for Texas I mentioned, we will ship you a stack of cards, a little bit bigger than this one. It'll look a lot like this, but it'll say Texas instead of Florida. You'll find that it's got the message on the back by Environmental Voter Project, faint text for a reason you'll learn when you do the training. And so what you need to do is you'll get a list from us. You'll literally copy the message. Its last time was 18 words, total. from EVP with your name signed, like in my case, Pam, environmental voter, project volunteer. You'll carefully put the address on, and I really want to stress that you put exactly what it says. We had a lot of folks who thought, oh, that's not a good address, and tried to skip it. And I did some follow-up and help people understand that sometimes those addresses look different to us because they are, say, on an tribal lands, Native American reservation. So you just want to do exactly what it says. It's really easy. I've had people do this during the debates while having COVID at the same time and doing postcards. Good stress reduction. And I've heard people doing that. Wouldn't try that your first time, but doing it as you wait between calls on the phone bank. So a lot of different, that's Leslie, a lot of good options there. Cost-wise, we would love for you to buy the stamps yourself, but it's now $56 for a roll of 100 stamps, and that would be a really great way to help toward this effort. I think I covered it all, Frances. Did I miss anything?
I think we've got it all.
Okay.
So
we want to get on to the
we
action.
could probably do questions for a lot longer, but unfortunately we're running low on time. So thank you so much, Nathaniel. We appreciate you taking your time to share your expertise with us around voter mobilization. You've shown us the importance of our participation, encouraging others to vote by providing them the information they need to do so. And thank you so much again for being our guest this evening and our long-term partner. And also thank you to Deb and Wanda for sharing their experience. Now, we hope all of you will stay on with us for our 15-minute action party with the Climate Action Now app. We've taken more than 2,000 actions at our action parties this year. So let's see if we can break 2,500 this month. So let's get this action party started. Liz and Matt, do you want to get us started and tell us how we can use the Climate Action Now app? And after we get started, we can continue our discussion with Nathaniel while people take actions.
Hello. I want to introduce myself to everyone. I'm Liz, the new Director of Outreach at Climate Action Now. Matthew has been incredibly wonderful throughout his years at Climate Action Now, and we'll be moving on to film school soon. So you'll start to see me at these calls instead. So are folks able to see my screen right now with the action tracker up? Okay, I see a nod from Brett. Thanks, Brett. All right, so if you've done this before, you know the drill. Just go ahead and scan the QR code. If you're new, we like to call this the action tracker. So what we've got here on the right is the QR code where you just need to hold up your phone, open the camera, and then when you see the little yellow bubble pop up, just click that, and this will take you to the specific set of actions that we have curated for you to take tonight. And if you're having trouble with that, there's another option as well, which is that you can type this link that's on the bottom, but it has to be in your phone browser, not on a computer. And then on the left, what we've got is our dynamic goal tracker. This is the blue marble, our home planet that we love, and this is increasing with every action that you guys take. So we've got a few actions in the bank already, but our goal for tonight is 650. So looking forward to getting up there to that number. Another note as well, if you see an action that you don't want to take or you've already taken, there's a skip option. Again, this list has been curated specifically for y'all on this call. Some of the things that we've got on this campaign for you include the first one, signing up to join the Elders Promote the Vote event. That might sound familiar from this call. And again, if you've already taken that action from the links in the chat, feel free to skip. We've got telling major newspapers to cover the climate policy differences between the Biden-Harris and Trump-Pence administrations. We've got thanking Vice President Kamala Harris and our new presumptive nominee for her dedication to fighting climate change. Lots of good stuff in there.
I know one of the questions we get asked a lot by can-doers, which is our term for folks who take action with the app, is do the messages they send actually make a difference? And they do indeed. There was a survey by the Congressional Management Foundation, which is a nonprofit that studies this sort of thing. And they showed, they did a survey of congressional staffers in which they learned from the survey that the only thing that was more influential with congressional offices than sending individualized emails was meeting in person or representing a larger organization. So number one, you represent an organization, you go and you meet the congressperson in his or her office. Number two, you just meet personally in the office. And number three, you're sending individualized email messages. It doesn't have to be phone calls. It's email messages are just as good because most congressional offices are not actually reading in detail our immortal prose, that we send in. They're keeping a tally of constituent opinions on different subjects, and that is what gets reported to the congressional leader. So getting the app, we made it an app because we all have phones with us all the time, right? And when you're 5 minutes in line at Starbucks or the grocery store or whatever, you can take out your phone, and as many of you know, you can send a well-researched, well-written, personalized email or message to your congressional leaders as business CEOs or editors of national newspapers. You can do that with 2 or 3 touches. And a lot of people tell us they learn a lot about climate issues just by reading the boilerplate messages that we prepared for them. Matthew, would you add anything to what I'm saying? Put him on the spot.
That's a good question. I think you pretty much covered the waterfront. I'll let you know if I think of any other points to add, but that seems pretty comprehensive to me.
Well, let me give you another reason or another proof, if you will, that your messages matter. And it took us a couple years to figure this out, but here's how it goes. Public opinion is the only effective counterweight to the massive power of the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry knows that, which is why it spends hundreds of millions of dollars trying to influence the public with disinformation. And even dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping know this, which is why they spend so much effort controlling their media. So public opinion is hugely powerful. So your opinion is powerful. And now I know a lot of people are thinking, well, my opinion alone is not powerful. Well, you're not alone. I mean, here you are on this call, right? You are doing things. And when you add your voice to the chorus of messages that are being sent to our leaders, it gets heard, and it really does make a difference. And here's another thing that I think all of you know. These people and the staffers in these offices know that for every constituent who took the trouble to send them a message, there are hundreds or thousands more who think the same thing but aren't taking the trouble. So they take your number and they multiply it times 100 or 1,000 to find out what is really going on. And because most people don't bother, your voice is disproportionately more important. So it really, really does make a difference. Using the CAN app is just one of the things you could do, of course. I'm a huge fan of the Environmental Voter Project. I probably heard Nathaniel give this talk 15 times, but I'm always intrigued. He always has new information for folks. I think that it's one of the best ways you can spend your time and spend your money would be donating to Environmental Voter Project and working with Pam and others at ECA. And in Climate Action Now, I just asked, in case we haven't already done it, I asked one of our people to create an action for can-doers to join ECA's programs, Promote the Vote program. So we will be sending emails I mean, not emails, people in the CAN app will from time to time see an action inviting you to sign up with ECA for these promote the vote activities.
Well, now that I've had some time to think, I have a couple things to add. One is the another thing that people often ask about is, I'm sending in these action parties, like 10, 20 emails to my member of Congress. Is that really valuable or impactful for them to get 10 emails from me in the same day? And our idea around that, the sort of concept that we've developed is the idea of raising the decibel level. So our understanding of how sort of congressional offices work, obviously they get a ton of messages, and it's mostly a staffer just tallying up all of the messages that they get. And so one of the sort of main things we're trying to do, obviously, we want to do, targeted interventions on bills and particular issues. But if nothing else, one of the main things that we're doing when we're sending these messages is we're putting a tally mark on a sheet that says somebody wrote in about climate. And that matters. That's a big deal because, at the end of the day, that's going to be weighed against, well, how many people wrote in about, they want more guns or whatever it is. And we want to have more tallies on our sheet than those people. So that's another kind of point that we like to make. And the second thing I'd say is that I lost it. I had it, I lost it. But that was I've talked enough. Yeah.
I don't know if you were going to say this, Matthew, but I'll say it. Another thing that people say to us, well, and I could say the same thing because I'm in Oregon and it's a solid blue state with two fantastic senators and a representative who are totally on board. And people say, well, it does no good for me to contact my legislator because they're already with the program. The answer to that is no, everybody can always do more than what they're doing. You and me, we can always do more. And so if you don't ask, it won't happen. So that is why even if your legislator is totally on board, your legislator can do more. They can more bills, they can advocate, with their colleagues and so on. So
that was it. That was what I was trying to think of. Really? Yeah, they can always do more. And then actually a slightly different thing that I was going to say is, and we're also giving air cover to those legislators who want to do good things. So we're giving them ammunition to bring to the floor or to bring to whoever they're negotiating with to say, hey, I got 300 emails from my constituents who all want this. So, sorry, Mr. Mrs. Lobbyist, I'm going to have to do this instead. I'm going to have to do the thing that my constituents want instead of what you want.
Yeah, and so the common denominator between what you're doing with the Climate Action Now app and what you're doing with the Environmental Voter Project and what you're doing with ECA, there is a common denominator, and that is communication. It's all about communication. And if you're not communicating, you're not accomplishing anything. And if you are communicating, you're making a difference. It's practically guaranteed.
I'd like to jump in and add something to what you both said, if that's okay.
Sure.
One of the options you'll see, and you may not be doing it right now because we're listening to the call, I know I'm not, is I'm hitting send an email, not do a call. But doing the call is also really valuable. And my memory is that has more impact than the email. And you might think it's difficult, but it's not really. You'll call, you'll probably talk to your local staff or maybe the folks in DC. After a while, they get to know your voice. You get to know their voice. You might meet up at an event and be able to say hi. And there's a really nice personal connection there, which then helps the weight that you bring to the subjects that are important to you. I've done this myself. I've seen youth do it, like I said, fourth graders and up. I've seen the plaintiffs from various cases and myself do this in DC with some pretty amazing elected officials. So, and some maybe not so amazing, but we still went and talked to them and they listened to what we had to say. So I really want to make a pitch for all those things. We don't talk about it so much lately, but ECA is involved in doing in-person lobbying as well.
Yeah, and you really do get the hang of the phone calls, and once in a while a human being actually answers, and that can be golden. I mean, then you can ask a question, right? You can find things out, and you make a personal connection. So I agree, but I also think if do what works for you, right? That's the most important thing, is to do something, do what works for you.
And look at this, we're at 620 actions. We're super close to our goal. So keep pushing those buttons. We're almost there.
Oh, and by the way, we have actually started giving people the ability to send messages from the Climate Action Now website. That you don't have to have the Climate Action Now app in order to send messages. If you go to climateactionnow.com and up in the little menu, choose the little, that little vegan hamburger menu, the little 3 bars, touch that, and you'll see a featured action and you'll see recommended actions. And those are just web forms. You can just go and do all of those actions as well. And by the way, I'm really sorry to say it, but I think this is the last time. I know some of you have been here before on this 15 minutes of action. This will be our last time. Well, I think you heard it before with Matthew. He's not abandoning us. He's doing what he told me he was going to do 4 years ago, and that he wanted to be a Hollywood screenwriter. And he didn't. He said, "Don't worry, Brett. I probably won't. It may not ever happen, or it may take a few years." And I knew any day he might call me and say, gee. And so he was accepted at the UCLA Film School, and he's off to do that. But Liz came out of the Stanford School of the Environment and is going to be
Yale, yeah.
Yale School of the Environment. I'm sorry, and is going to be with all of you on the national calls going forward, and I also from time to time. Getting darn close, folks. Only 13 more messages. If you haven't taken out your phone and pointed at that QR code, please do that right now. And I just took one thanking President Biden for being a great climate president. Oh my gosh, he was a terrific president on climate, did more than everybody before him combined. So we will miss him, but we're looking forward to what Kamala Harris will do in the future. Almost there. Oh my goodness. By the way, can doers with the app have sent over 2.3 million messages in the last 3 years. And the average can doer sends 10 messages a day. And that compares with, people doing conventional advocacy, maybe do 1 or 2 a week. So this is really a way for you to amplify your voice, make your opinion count much, much more than other people's opinions. And it's all about communication. All right, who out there is going to give us the 650th action? I don't know.
Ooh, 2 more. 1 more.
There it is. Woohoo!
Amazing job, you guys.
This is how we win, folks. Making phone calls, sending postcards. It's the most important thing we can do in the next 3.5 months.